I would like to invite Irene Frikholm and Stefan Johansson for a discussion which will make the Swedish connection to this Wagner story this afternoon.
You hear me? Yes? Because otherwise I have to rise and use my opera voice, which I wouldn't feel like, because I must say something personal. I think I have seen, of course, this film in my computer at home before we did this event. And I know most of the things that are spoken of in this, because that's my job, because I was chef dramaturg of an opera house where they do very much Wagner, and where you also work, Irene. And I have directed Parsifal, among many other things. But still, this experience of watching this movie with you here this afternoon, and with this particular audience, was completely devastating. I don't really know where to start again. And I'm happy that we have decided on forehand to recommence with something personal and simple. And can we have the first picture? Almost humorous. I think we know that. We need that. Here we see an advertisement from a Stockholm newspaper in the middle 40s. I think it's Christmas 43 or 44. And it shows 4 men who were very important in the musical life of Stockholm at that time. They were all conductors of the Royal Swedish Opera. And nowadays things are run very differently. So perhaps some of you need to be reminded that in those days, in an opera house who did 250 to 300 performances and concerts and ballets a year, you had perhaps 6 conductors who were there the whole time, and they conducted everything shared between them. They were not guesting all over the place and you didn't take in somebody for one special production. They were running a huge repertory together. And this radio firm obviously thought it recommendable to have those 4 Jewish conductors to be used in their advertisement to get Swedish citizens in this year of the war to go and buy new radios on the recommendation of those 4 men. And if we ask for the next picture, Irene and I will explain who they are. I take the one that needs the shortest explanation. We have Isai Dobroven, famous Russian, Norwegian, Soviet, Jewish conductor especially, who did among the first big, complete recordings of operas at all after the war. He left Sweden in 49, I think, and had an international career. Then we have on this side Kurt Bendix, who was really what we say in Swedish, a trotjänare, somebody who served faithfully at the Royal Opera in Stockholm. He came from the start from Germany, and he became Swedish, of course. And he, many times he was a bit put back by bigger talents and more explosive personalities, but he conducted very much Wagner, and studied with singers like Birgit Nilsson and so on, the whole repertory, although almost, I think, into the 70s or 80s. But then, Irene, you should help us with 2 of the others, because they are very close to you. Should we start with Herbert Sandberg?
Okay. Herbert Sandberg, that was my father. And my father was actually an assistant to Leo Blech, who you see there. And he worked with Leo Blech in Berlin, at the Staatsoper in Berlin. So when the Stockholm Royal Opera House were in big need of a new coach, it was the director...
1930 something? Or?
No, earlier, actually in the 20s. John Forsell, the man who was the head of the opera house then, he asked my grandfather, Leo, who very often had been conducting at the opera house as a guest, if he knew somebody who he could recommend, and he recommended my father. So there was my father in Stockholm. And actually, Kurt Bendix, he was also assistant of my grandfather's, and it was also on my grandfather's recommendation that Kurt Bendix came to Stockholm. So then we have Leo Blech, my grandfather, who who I got to know after my birth in the 40s, when he was in Stockholm in exile, where he was from 41 to 49.
Let us say a little more about your father, and then, because we have to do more job on your grandfather.
Yes.
He was more famous.
So start asking me, what do you want to know my father?
He is remarkable outside Wagner, because he did the earliest preserved recording, complete recording of Le Nozze di Figaro. So he's really important also as a link to the performance practice of the 19th century. And he did this with John Forsell, who you mentioned, who was his boss. And also Bruno Walter came to Stockholm, great Jewish German conductor, and he did Figaro. And then Forsell asked your father, how long time, Mr. Sandberg, will it take to reconstruct the performance? Because they thought that Bruno Walter did so many strange modern things. But then your father did, which we have documented here. We won't play it for you because we don't have time. But he is enshrined in this edition of Wagnerians in Stockholm. You can hear him conduct Parsifal in 1940. And this is absolutely unique in Europe, because in no other place, for very obvious reasons, no Jewish conductor would conduct Parsifal every year at an opera house as here.
Yeah.
But let's go on with your grandfather.
Oh, but if you want to know about Parsifal and my father, as a young girl and a teenager, I was not very much interested in the opera.
She's no Wagnerian.
Absolutely not in Wagner. I spent my nights at jazz clubs and enjoying that kind of music. And when I came to the opera house, I came there in order to pick up my father, because he was conducting. And I remember very well one night when I was going to pick him up from a performance of Parsifal, which I hadn't ever seen before. And I came in, was sitting in a little box because I came in the middle of the show, and there was this lady with very long hair brushing somebody's feet with her long hair, and I thought, this is madness. What is going on? What is my father doing? I was very upset, and I told my father, what is this? And he said, that's Wagner. And I said, I don't understand anything, but he said, you should close your eyes, don't skip the text, and just enjoy the music, because it's the music which makes everything worth, and especially in Parsifal. Just a little story.
That's a story about Parsifal. Yep. It's very good to hear as a director of that whole show.
Yep.
But then your grandfather, he really has a very exceptional story, because he remained, or was asked or ordered to remain in his post after 1933, when almost every other Jewish conductor or director were expelled or driven into exile. Yeah. Tell us about that, because that's really remarkable.
Because this is remarkable, because my grandfather was more German than any other German. He considered himself. He was appointed kaiserlicher, preußischer head of director, Generalmusikdirektor. And he was very proud of it, and he loved Germany. He loved Berlin, especially where he lived. And when things started to change, and Hitler came, and my grandfather had a head of the opera house, name was Heinz Tietjen, who was befriended with Goering. And Goering was a very big admirer of my grandfather's work. So in 1933, they decided that lots of the Jewish conductors around them already didn't work anymore in Berlin. But my grandfather was allowed to stay because he was so popular and he did so much fantastic job, they considered. I have never spoken to my grandfather about this because I was a kid when I got to know him. But he had a scrapbook. You've seen that scrapbook. He started this scrapbook when my mother was born in 1913. And it was not only a scrapbook about my mother and her life, it was a scrapbook about everything which happened in Germany, then considering art, politics, music, whatever you want to. And he had cuttings, press cuttings from these.
And little annotations of himself.
And then, of course, notations and comments on what happened. And even if he stayed on, there was this, I don't know if you remember, in 1933, he wrote, "Today I realize that I am a second-rate person." But he still went on because he loved it. And in 1937, I think, Goering went for a vacation somewhere in Italy, and now the real opponents of my grandfather staying in Berlin arranged that he had an early retirement, as they called it. So
Which could have meant death.
Could have meant death, but he went to Riga. He could go to Riga, and where he conducted for several years until the Germans came there. When he saw the fact that he was going, there was the ghetto awaiting him and his wife. He wrote a letter to Tietjen, this director in Berlin. Tietjen arranged with Goering that there was a car coming to Riga, to my grandparents' home, picking him up, taking him back to Berlin, straight to the Swedish embassy, where he got a visa, and in that way he came to Sweden, because he had been, since 25, he had been conducting quite a lot at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm. So he was very welcome here in Sweden. And here he stayed at the Royal Opera House, conducting a lot of
Birgit Nilsson's debut.
And not only that, but lots of Wagner and Carmen and Hänsel and Gretel, which was a very popular.
Yes, you were afraid of the witch.
Yes, I was afraid of the witch. And he stayed here until 1949. And in 1949, already in 1945, they asked him to come back to Berlin, but he didn't. But 1949, he couldn't hold himself back anymore. So we went straight back to Berlin, where he stayed, and he worked at the opera house. It was then called the Städtische Oper. And
now it was Tietjen's time to be protected by your grandfather.
Yes, but Tietjen had to be denazificiert, as they call it. And he asked my grandfather, please, to write about what he had done for my grandfather. But then my grandfather went back to Berlin, and he conducted a lot of performances, and until 1955, I think, and then he was already over 80 years old. And when he then had an accident, he broke his leg.
He fell from the podium, conducting Carmen.
Conducting Carmen. Huh? You see, he knows much more about my grandfather than I do.
No, you have told me.
And then he decided, if I can't stand up and conduct, then I will resign, which he did. But the question is, why did he come back, and how does it come that he really could work in this country where things had happened, which, well, he should have stayed in Sweden, lots of people think, and especially his Jewish colleagues. They never could excuse him for partly staying so long in Berlin and also not going or coming back again.
But we saw also in his scrapbook, there was something in the period after 1933 and before he leaves Berlin, when he writes that now conditions at work have been intolerable or something. Yeah. And one understands that Goering must come back and tell the orchestra to obey him.
I didn't know that. You see, yeah.
But really the main point, if we think of the film, also that is that he loved his music.
He loved Wagner.
Put a lot of his life into performing it. He even went to North America with a touring group of himself. And if you Google Leo Blech, you find 300,000 entries at once, of which very many are his conducting of Lauritz Melchior and Frida Leider and everyone in Wagner.
Yes.
How do you feel about this now when you see this?
After I've seen the film, I get the explanation, because he was exactly like many other of the artists we hear, conductors we hear. loved the music, and he didn't think about the other stuff because it didn't interest him. Because as an artist, he enjoyed so much to perform this music that he didn't care. It's two different things for him.
Did he get criticized by others, for example, other Jewish people when he went back to Germany or so on? Or do you know anything about that?
I don't know so much, but as I told you once, when I knew him in Berlin, I was a kid, so we mostly played post office, and he had to stamp my letters.
Of course.
But I know that, and my mother has told me that there was never a conflict for him in this, as he enjoyed so much doing good music, doing a good performance of fantastic music, and then he was actually also he was a pupil of Engelbert Humperdinck, who was a German composer, the one who composed Hänsel and Gretel, the opera. And Humperdinck was one of the last assistants to Wagner, and did actually also, I think, write some of the Wagner music for Wagner. I think some parts of the Parsifal. He wrote
4 bars for Parsifal for a scene change, they say.
And perhaps he influenced my grandfather introduced him to Wagner anyway.
But it's also amazing. We are soon rounding this off to get our whole panel on stage to discuss the film. But a colleague of your father, a concurrent, Klemperer,
yes,
was also conducting Wagner to the very day when he was thrown out. And Moje Forbach was Venus in his last performance of Tannhäuser. She told me in the 1980s, she was a very old woman, that when we had this general rehearsal of Tannhäuser, it was the last time we saw Klemperer, and suddenly he made a break in the middle of the music in the Venusberg and shouted, bring Mrs. Forbach a blonde wig, because otherwise the Völkischen will write that there are only Jews in the state opera. And when she told me this old woman who had heard this being said, spoken to a full house, so you see that this is such daring, such courage in the face of your grandfather choose something else, but probably he had the same attitude.
He might have had, because I know that he could sometimes say rather tough things to the people around him, partly in the orchestra pitch, but also to the singers on stage.
Yes.
Okay.
So, I think we thank you, Irene, for this contribution right from the sources.
Thank you.
And I will ask our participants in our round table to come up here and get their microphones, by the way. We have Joshua Sobol, we have Michael P. Steinberg, Igor Toronilalic, and Helan Warsaw, who made this film. Welcome up on stage. And we have Christina von Braun. She was the first one, so then I forgot her. Christina. I think we should start with our director, who is the man behind this film. When we started to plan this seminar, we didn't know this film existed. And it was a sort of an answer from outer space that someone had been thinking of this particular angle. You must tell us, what made you do it? What is your background to doing this film?
First of all, is the microphone on? Yes, okay, it's good to know. Well, I think the dilemma that's explored in the film, the dilemma faced by the musicians that the film is about, is a dilemma that I identified with. I came at Wagner from 2 very different standpoints in my life. I have a background as a musician. Before I went to film school, I was a musician, a violinist, and a conducting student. And so in that connection, I studied and performed Wagner's music, was quite fascinated with it, was also fascinated with Wagner as a predecessor of film, which is a subject I'm quite interested in. and have written a few essays about. So I was interested in Wagner creatively. And really loved his music, I must say, and in the present tense also. I'm also Jewish, and my family is Israeli, and you know, a few generations ago, most of that family was wiped out in the Holocaust, and so Wagner was a total taboo in my house. Although I came from a musical family, when Wagner came in the radio was shut off. In fact, my sister and I belonged to the children's chorus in the Metropolitan Opera, and when we were cast as extras in the Metropolitan's production of Lohengrin, we were withdrawn from the children's chorus. So this was a strong stance in my family. So I became very fascinated by Wagner, by this, you know, individual that I had such divergent...
Who is this man they don't want me to know? Huh?
Right, yes. And the forbidden fruit is, of course, always most tantalizing, which I think is probably something undergirding a lot of what goes on in the movie, for both Wagner and the Jews, actually. So I was interested in looking at this and looking for a project that would allow me to do that. And then when I found out that Wagner had this whole collection of Jewish assistants, it just really seized my imagination, and I wanted to know who these people were, what these relationships were like, and that's how I came to make the movie.
But to do it, you must have studied this very closely, because I can't really find any, as I said before, a bit braggingly, I know quite a lot, but I didn't find you missed anything during this time period. How long have you been working on this and the research for the movie?
It took about a year of full-time work, but I had been researching it for a couple of years before that.
Yes? So, who is the first to venture an opinion? Because perhaps we want your reactions very now when we are all hit by the film like this. Joshua Schobel, you're a dramatist, a writer, and so on. What is your first impression of this?
First of all, I must say that I've written 3 plays about Wagner, which were not yet produced because, well, people are not very enthusiastic about putting on a Wagner drama on the stage in Israel. So I'm trying to get it done. 2 of the plays are impossible plays because they are like 240 pages long each one.
Like Wagner?
Yeah, like Wagner's. One of them is called, the title of one of them is Wagner in Absentia. And because Wagner used to say that he drives people crazy and then he disappears. He said it repeats itself, this kind of pattern repeats itself in my life. I'm driving people crazy and then I piss off. And so I decided to try to follow Wagner throughout all these victims that he left behind him. People who were terribly damaged by Wagner, mainly women. After all, with men he somehow came to terms, like with Levi after having offended him terribly, but he came to terms with him. I think Wagner had a terrible problem with women. And he was, if we examine his biography, we see that he was attracted mainly to married women of people who were his benefactors. Well, one example is Jessie Lossot, the other one is Mathilde Wesendonck, and the third one, of course, is Cosima Bilov, von Bilov. Well, Bilov was not his benefactor, but Wesendonck was one. And it made me think that Wagner, when he was having a relationship with a woman, he had to cast her in a double role of a mother and a daughter at the same time. So she should have been much younger than him and married to a father figure. Wesendonck was a typical father figure for Wagner, and Mathilde was a typical daughter figure for him. But being married to a father figure, she was also his mother. So Yeah. So I think that he was mainly attracted by incest, Wagner. And it appears in his operas, of course. Siegfried is an incestual character, although he's not absolutely aware of it. But
The whole first act of Valkyrie, they discuss incest in a kitchen.
Of course. Yes? So, the fact that he was so interested in incest and was so attracted by it, this is one of his characteristics, but this is what made me very much think of Wagner as a self-denied Jew. And when it comes to talking about Wagner and Judaism, I would rather talk about Wagner as a Jew, or Wagner as a Jew who didn't accept his Jewishness and fought against it as much or as badly as he could. And I think, well, it's not only a joke. If I had to define what is Judaism in a nutshell, I would say it is an attitude of believing in a God in whom you cannot believe. Yeah, or rather having a relationship with God like with a very crazy father who gets angry at you and then throws you out of home and kicks you away and spreads you all over the world and takes revenge on you. And you know that he's crazy, but he's your father. Anyway. So I think that Wagner, I don't want to enlarge about it, maybe we'll do it later, but I really think that Wagner had this problem of being, first of all, suspecting that he had Jewish blood running in his veins. I'm also suspicious that there's Jewish blood running in my veins, as every Jew, I must say. Because we are all a mixture. We have parents. I knew my grandmother and grandfather who emigrated from the Ukraine in 1922 to Israel. And my grandmother, she looked like a Russian peasant. I don't know if there was Russian blood or Cossack blood running in her veins and so on and so forth. But I knew a historian of anti-Semitism, a Russian-French Jew, Leon Polyakov, who wrote a remarkable work on anti-Semitism and, among other things, treated the case of Wagner. And he claimed that if you examine the case history of every great or notorious anti-Semite, you will find out that either he has some Jewish descent or ancestry, or he suspects himself of having a Jewish hidden father or mother somewhere along the line. And with Wagner, we know that his stepfather, Geyer, probably joked or didn't joke when he asked Wagner's mother, Johanna, when he saw little Wagner, the kid, playing with Jewish kids in the Brühl in Leipzig, where he was born, which was a Jewish neighborhood. He asked Johanna, did you have by chance a Jewish lover? Meaning, Wagner, he looks like a Jewish kid. Very typical. Now, Wagner told this story to Kozyba at a certain point. And so it haunted him. And I think that he was a kind of haunted Jew. So what in one of my plays about him, I have a scene where shortly before he passes away, he has a kind of nightmare in which Ahasver, played by Meyerbeer, makes an audition where Wagner wants to play the eternal Jew, the eternal wandering Jew, and Meyerbeer, Ahasver, tortures him, torments him, and gives him all kinds of orders to carry out as in this audition.
Another father figure.
Yeah, another father figure, of course. And finally tells him that he's not yet ripe to play really the character of the eternal Jew, but he should do some efforts about it, and then he may reach the point where he can be casted as the eternal wandering Jew. And to justify himself, he says, well, but I have created already so many characters of Jews in my operas. Alberich, there is Mime, there is Kundry, and Ahasver says that's not enough. You have to wander another 300 years to be kicked out from more places, to see your parents burned and so on, and your family destroyed. Then come back and we can talk, and maybe I can cast you as the eternal wandering Jew. So this is my answer, what attracts me in Wagner and what I can see in his character.
Thank you so much. Christina von Braun, those people that we saw in the movie, so well described by Hilal, they all know, or should have known, that Wagner was a virulent anti-Semite and that he had written this about this Judentum in their Musik, about their destruction, really. What kind of destruction? That's open to discussion, as we saw. Then today, most audiences, they know all this also, because they can't open a program book without reading about those things, if it isn't really in some very whitewashing opera house somewhere, we don't know. But if you buy a ticket to a concert or an opera performance of Wagner, you probably know this, or you will be told. And if I or somebody else moderate a concert, that's among the first things we start to allude to. And the audience are sometimes even, yes, 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 we know, let's go on with the music. So what is your reaction to the film and to how we stand intellectually to this today?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Joshua, for what you said. Just let me put this in. And listening to you, I was just wondering, well, if this is the attitude towards Wagner, having played in Israel, you sort of have opened the door with your sense of the irony of very different aspects. But to come back to your question, Stefan, yes. I love the film. I saw it now for the second time. I saw it already in New York. I really think it's a great film. And yes, sorry, I'll keep the eye.
Before the mouth.
No, I'll keep the microphone closer, yes. Yes, I saw the film now for the second time, and I saw things which I had not seen the first time. I heard things, and I think it's really very, very instructive and a good film, especially as it hits you. Within 60 minutes, you get all these characters, and it hits their destiny, hits you. Now, this obviously is not the only question you have asked.
I just wanted to lead you into this.
Yeah. So, to come back to what Joshua said, I think that there's a way of thinking about Wagner and his music which has a lot to do with an envy of Wagner about Jewishness. I think this envy comes from something very specific, which has to do with Jewish traditions. For this, I just have to make a very short excursion into language. In the 19th century, you have a language problem, a literature problem. A lot of writers explain that they feel imprisoned in language, that they are not free within language. A lot of writers write about this. And this was due to the fact that writing had, with general alphabetization, with a printing book, had become so dominant over spoken language. Now, in Jewish traditions, you have a very strong orality, which has always played both in religion and in other contexts a very strong role. This is partly due to the Hebrew system of writing, that orality could never get lost. And so I think what Wagner realized is that language within Christian Europe had lost this power of the spoken language, of oral language, and that in some way you had to fight against the imprisonment within written language. And he saw that the Jews did not have exactly the same problem within their own religion, where orality was always what transmitted a new way of thinking about religion. And I think, and this is maybe where Wagner was a certain genius, he said, well, let's make music become our orality. The Christian way of, or the Western, European, non-Jewish way of thinking how the texts can become alive again. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why we are, or so many people are fascinated with his music and just forget about the other part of Wagner, forget about his theories, and forget about his awful libretti. The texts are just terrible, one must say.
As texts, yes.
As texts, and they forget even about the stories, because the stories are terrible too. But they love the music because all of a sudden he gave back to the texts something which comes out of an oral tradition, but which is not really oral tradition because it's instrumentation after a notation system. So it's if you so like it, it's an orality born out of the text, something quite different from the Jewish.
What you say is very important because, of course, Wagner took word and made it to music, as banal as it may be. But if we think of that going on or you want to conclude this thought?
I think the problem we're really getting at in this case is the whole problem of the unconscious. If you like, we can pick that up a bit later, but that is really the problem with Wagner. To put it in a nutshell, I think you could say that everyone was trying to find what the unconscious is about, and of course Freud, a few decades later, would tell us what the unconscious is about. But what Wagner tried to do, and this he says explicitly in some places, in a letter to Mathilde von Wesendonck too, he says, I want to overwhelm the unconscious with my music. I want to grasp, I want to possess the unconscious of people. And that, I think, is the big difference.
And there you have the whole theory of leitmotif and everything in a nutshell, really.
Yes.
Michael, you seem very eager to give us your reaction of the film. Yes?
This was already so interesting. It can only get better. It can only get worse. I did something fairly perverse in the last couple of years. I tried to read some of the texts of the operas because for so many years I had the same educated opinion about how awful the texts are. And in some way they are awful, but in some way the center of what Wagner is doing textually begins to reveal some extremely interesting symptoms that come out through language. And perhaps they are symptoms, as symptoms are, of the unconscious and maybe even of a certain kind of Jewish unconscious, but they are definitely symptoms of language doing some work in Wagner that becomes very interesting if you actually listen to the words. I'll give you an example. In Parsifal, which is, as we heard in the film, really like a kind of the navel of the whole problem. It's where the problem of the Wagner, the Jews, and anti-Semitism is the most intense. There's a certain rhyme, and everybody will know that Wagner always rhymed. He rhymed in very perverse ways. He rhymed according to a philologically phony 19th century idea of the origins of German rhyme. This is what you learn when you begin to study it. But there's a certain rhyme in Parsifal which opens up extraordinarily interesting and problematic, out of control ambiguities, and that's the rhyme between Erlöser and Böser, right? Erlöser meaning the Redeemer, and Parsifal is all about the necessity of the Redeemer to redeem himself, whether that Redeemer is God or Jesus Christ or Wagner himself. Everybody has written, starting with Nietzsche, a great deal about all of this. It's also about Amfortas and Parsifal. It goes through the opera intensely. And then the redemption is against evil forces in the self. But the rhyme, when Wagner begins to use that rhyme of the Redeemer rhyming with the evil character, right, the Böser meaning the evildoer, all sorts of things come out that have to do in almost a physical way between the word and its rhyme, or between the ambiguity between redemption and evil. And it's a very powerful idea that cannot be solved. It cannot be solved in the opera. It cannot be solved by Wagner or really by any of us. And I think the more one spends time with this kind of work, the more one realizes that the interesting questions cannot be solved. And that includes the question of the beauty of the music and the meaning of the text. So we cannot escape Wagner the man by going to the works. And when we're inside the works, we really cannot escape the questionable arguments inside the actual art, the operas, by going only to the music. To me, it always reminds me metaphorically of one of my favorite insights from a school teacher of mine, actually a teacher of mathematics, and I was always terrible at mathematics. But I remember a class when I was 13 or 14 years old about the problem of dividing by zero. This mathematics teacher said, "You cannot divide by zero." And then somebody, of course, asked, well, why not? And I remember he got very anxious because he didn't understand the theories of mathematics to that extent. But he then showed a film, which you can all find on YouTube, of the collapse of a bridge in 1940. And he claimed that the bridge collapsed because one of the architects, in an obscure design moment, had actually divided by zero. The result was a collapse of the bridge. And the point is that all of these rationalizations, I hate the man, I love the work. I couldn't conduct the work if I thought the music was anti-Semitic. Daniel Barenboim has said this quite often. The separation of the text and the music. Ultimately, you're dividing by zero. And you can't divide by zero. It doesn't work. You have to understand this world for its genius and its symptomatic character, and then be in it and learn something, or not. But you have to take it for everything that's there. It's one of the things the film does so nicely. When I first saw the title of the film, I immediately thought it had two subjects. One is the subject, Ilan, you treat. The other is one you suggest, possibly as a sequel, because there is a scene of Siegfried and Mime from Patrice Chéreau's production, which was extremely courageous and very successful, as many of its imitators have not been successful, of clearly showing Mime, and before Mime, Loge, even more interesting character, played by the same singer, as a Jew. It was a very courageous thing to do, and it was done without stereotype, without cliché. And it's clearly right. It's clearly right. But the point is that Wagner had deep identifications with these characters. And Leon Botstein is absolutely right to start that list with Lohengrin, and which is, of course, not one of the obvious candidates.
The thing you're pointing to also in the first part of what you said now, that is really something I've thought over, that if we look at what drama we play from the 19th century, Schiller, Goethe, and so on are played at least in Germany and Middle Europe. There are plays from the late 18th century that are in the repertory, but really, before we come to Ibsen and Chekhov and Strindberg, Wagner, willy-nilly what we think about the content of his texts, or that's the only drama from that period that we still stage. And that's very interesting. And it also reminds you of the fact that the Germans have lost 2 wars, but they have totally won in musicology. If you look at our lack of contact with and knowledge about Wagner's contemporaries, and people say, oh, yeah, he was protected by Meyerbeer and he later betrayed him and so on. How many of those people have heard a full Meyerbeer opera, which I think is essential to judge Wagner's work? But now I'm going to turn to Igor, because we had a little conversation yesterday that made me also think about but you are going, it's you who are saying what you want to say. But I was thinking also relativizing this whole thing, that you could as well, of course, make a film of, it wouldn't be as tragical or as strong, but you could, of course, make a film which was called Why Did Scandinavians Flock to Wagner? Was it because their voices, or that he exploited our our old myths or whatever? Or is this whole, the idea that I throw out to Lizzie 2 years ago, why don't you make a seminar on why the Jews flocked to Wagner's as sponsors and lovers and artists and conductors and so on, but perhaps it's entirely wrong.
I think there are for me, there is a problem, both with the idea of greatness being associated with Wagner and the idea of focusing in so narrowly on Wagner and the Jews. I think Wagner and his problem with humans. I mean, I think, you know, this idea that, okay, we assume he's a genius, and there are several good reasons for this, and his greatness seems to be without doubt, because he certainly influenced the next generation of composers and the generation after that, petering out slowly in the 40s, 50s, till now really the composers have no interest, who are practicing today with Wagner. So he had, but for a period, the period that we really care about, we seem to obsess about, in terms of concert programming, late 19th century, early 20th century, he was very influential. But I do doubt the possibility that a man who so readily, his solution to any problem in life is annihilation, is either suicidal, sexual, homicidal, holocaustal, you know, whether it's in terms of women desperately having to just kill themselves. You know, you offer up a woman in an opera just for a plot device, and at the end you throw her on the pyre, which often happens in Wagner operas, or various other characters who are maniacs, who are offered up as heroes. I think opera can, I think great works of art can be amoral. They can be moral. I mean, probably my favorite works of art are usually pretty good, actually, pretty virtuous. They teach you about life. But I don't think greatness should or can be associated with immorality, and I think there's a huge amount of immorality in virtually every single opera by Wagner, and it's not just incidental to the operas, it's the thrust of the operas. The thrust of the operas is psychopathic. It is about annihilation of yourself, of other people, usually also always of women. And I have a massive problem with this. So I think focusing in on the Jews is symptomatic. I mean, there were a lot of people who had problems with Jews, Eliot and, you know, great artists who had problems with Jews, often incidental. In Wagner's operas, it becomes more central. The characters are there. They're obviously stereotypes, Beckmesser, etc., etc. But far broader, what was Wagner's problem with being a human? Why was he so inhumane in his life, and then carried through in his art, and carried through into the music, which doesn't allow you to think or breathe or work with you? It suffocates you. It's waterboarding. I mean, it's wonderful if you like that sort of thing, but I'm not into S&M. It doesn't have any of the humanity of Mozart or any of the other greats that we love so much. The delicacy of characterization, the lack of preaching. There is message in all of Wagner's operas, telling you to like Siegfried, to not like Mimir, to like this character, not like that character, to like always the idiot, Trump-like hero, the innocent, the naive. Parsifal, Siegfried, these are fools who we should never go to idolize. We should like Wolfram, we should like Fricka, but they're tossed aside because they're the old order. They think calmly, rationally, they're pragmatic, they're sweet, they're nice. No, sod those. We want the nasty Trump-like hero.
Yeah. And so you think really that it's really just incidental that we find all those examples of especially Jewish connection to Wagner. It could be anybody else.
I think other people should be more outraged by Wagner than they are. I mean, women should be outraged. Humans should be outraged in general.
Yes.
But Jews absolutely should be more outraged than any other ethnic minority. Yes, I think that it is incidental, and I was just talking to Hilan, and I was trying to figure out what are the stats on the numbers of Jews that were involved in music, and I think it was very high, and so that could be the reason why a lot of Jews, but to sort of, I don't know, I don't like this kind of, it's sort of pinning the blame on these sort of self-hating Jews, and what's wrong?
That they liked him because they were masochists.
Yeah, what is this? I mean, you know, there were a lot of Jews in music, and several of them were very talented, and they happened to like Wagner. There were a lot of non-Jews who also liked Wagner.
Of course,
I don't think
like
there's
Scandinavians,
anything
for
Jewish
example.
about the fact of liking Wagner. I don't think they want themselves to sort of ally with anti-Semites.
Igor and the rest of you, I would like to confront you with something on this theme which is very recent. I forgot the newspaper beside Irene, but I can quote it from memory. I read recently in the New York Review of Books a critique or a report on a new book by Ian Buruma, at least part Jewish as far as I know, part Dutch. And a book he has written about his great-grandparents in Britain during the war and their life, and they were all Jewish, and he describes their life as very staunch British patriots, which they become living there, and also keeping all the time contact as far as they can with Germany. They have many friends and family who disappear or are destroyed in the Holocaust. But as soon as the war is over, the grandmother arranges something for the whole family to do. And that's an excursion to Bayreuth in 1951, when the festival commences at all. And those were, of course, not at all unknowing of anything. They must have known anything that we know here about this, and about Wagner's anti-Semitism, and about the cultural climate in Germany during the years they were absent from there. And then, of course, you must ask, why? And then he says that their whole correspondence during the whole war is filled with references to Beethoven, to Bach, to all the German music tradition. And he speculates that, which I now quote from memory, that the love of the German music was a way of being German without stopping to be a Jew. And that's his conclusion. But it's a rather, for an outsider, it's of course a very blatant fact that the first thing they can think of doing together after the war is going to Bayreuth. How do you react, Hilal?
Well, first thing, just to sort of respond to what Igor said, I think Igor is actually a connection to a much older and more venerable tradition of Wagner-phobia. I mean, for the first, Wagner, to his great delight, inspired fervent opposition for as long as he was writing, and especially writing manifestos. And for the first 100 years of Wagner-phobia, the question of the anti-Semitism was not particularly central. People like Schopenhauer, himself a terrific anti-Semite, had precisely or nearly Igor's problem with Wagner. It's bad art because it's immoral. He hated the fact that Siegfried just, kills Mime, this figure who's his protector, and we're supposed to cheer for it. So yes, I don't especially think that, the lone blot on Wagner's character is the fixation on Jews. Cosima herself, capable of monstrous behavior towards Jews and others, said about Wagner, Richard has a great propensity to find someone's weakest point, and then he takes delight in really going like that. He did it to her. He hated Catholics. He hated French people. She was both. So yeah, and of course he also liked surrounding himself with the object of his derision. Which is, so I don't think that that's the only thing one there is to say about one. As far as, these masochistic Jewish musicians or not, I don't think there's anything. On one hand, you have to say the mystery of why Jews flocked to Wagner. That was the mystery I sort of wanted to look into in making the film. And the first thing I realized is that it's actually not so much a mystery. There were tons of Jews in music. You look at Brahms, who was Wagner's sort of polar opposite in the culture wars of the late 19th century in music. There were as many Jews around Brahms as there were around Wagner. So one has to say that, as professionals, as consumers in the music industry, you couldn't ignore Wagner, and Jews didn't. So I don't think that because Levi conducted Wagner's music, because Tausig arranged Wagner's music, this is an indication of a pathology. However, the fact that Levi would absolutely abase himself specifically about being Jewish in relation to Wagner, the fact that Rubinstein would write such a letter as he wrote to Wagner and then take his own life. Wagner's daughter Isolde wrote in her memoir that he killed himself because he saw the truth about himself in Wagner's Judaism in music. She wrote that after Wagner's death. That becomes, you start to wonder whether there is something going on here that is symptomatic of a deeper insecurity, a troubled soul that some Jews had in the late 19th century in Germany and in Europe in general. And I think one thing to say about Wagner's anti-Semitism is that he was brilliant in how he went about it, because there was always an asterisk. Whatever he said about the Jews as a race, he always said, but the good ones, the ones who are devoted to the cause of true art, and of course you know what he meant by that, the ones who are willing to give their time, their energy, their money to me. These are the exceptions. These are the ones who are, as Botstein said in the film, exceptional Jews.
He promises them to sort of
supersede
their Jewishness by sacrificing to him.
Absolutely, and it says nothing, it certainly doesn't lessen his anti-Semitism, because the exceptions prove the rule, much like...
And the exceptions should be changed into something else, into Germans or whatever.
Or pure humans. Humanity is actually something he spoke about a great deal, whatever we think about his definition
of
it.
Then the span in this discussion that's encouraging, very wide, because to what Igor said, I would say that many people of any kind of descent, they look for psychopaths in art. That's why young people enclose themselves and rave with extremely loud music and drugs and so on. And if you see the pictures of Wagner audiences from the 1880s, 1890s, there is a picture of Aubrey Birdsley. It's called Wagnerians or Tristan or something like that. And it's called Effeminate Men and Mad Women. That's the one who glorify Wagner. But also, there is something that Irene really pointed out about her grandfather's obligation to Wagner, that artists are usually thinking of other things than the audience does. They think of artistic discipline, for example, and loyalty to a performance tradition, and to see to that there is a performance tonight. And then they obviously are able to swallow rather horrible things from the same people whose music they play and sort of guard.
Job.
Yeah. Michael.
I think the anecdote about the Baruma family going to Bayreuth brings up some important issues, some of which I think Christina touched on a few minutes ago. I look forward to reading that. It sounds very perverse to go to Bayreuth, and probably at any point, but certainly in 1951. And 1951 was the year the festival reopened, being allowed by the American occupation forces to reopen. So
if it wasn't 51, it was 52. Well, I quoted from memory.
So a little less, 10% less, but still very problematic. But the underlying point is profound, and that is, we, I think, tend to judge too quickly what used to be called, the German-Jewish symbiosis, an argument that was attacked very strongly and a little too quickly by Gershom Scholem and other people, obviously after the Holocaust. And the argument is that from Lessing onward, the idea that the Germans and Jews could somehow blend was an illusion and politically naive, which may be true, but also that it was an inner lie, which is a judgment I think we should be very careful about making, because the point has to do with how deeply one feels a relationship or even an ownership of certain cultural heritage. And to say, as Wagner said, that these people are dangerous because they speak as we do, and they're more dangerous when they don't look different, and they're more dangerous when their language isn't different. From the point of view of the Jewish bourgeoisie, the educated bourgeoisie, there in fact is no difference. These people grew up after generations of being inside the language and inside the culture, and in a way one wants to understand this, or at least one wants to allow the possibility that this was a German reaction about cultural ownership and cultural feeling, which we shouldn't judge too quickly, even if the Holocaust stands in its way. And one way of the kind of urgency and need to participate, in fact, goes back to this 19th century issue that Stefan and Christina, you both mentioned, and that has to do with the anxiety of language as a tool of real human contact. And this is a kind of modernist problem. It's not, and music becomes a very important player in this. So I think you're absolutely right that there's this gap in German literary drama in the 19th century, but I think it's the situation is even worse than you say, because you have the same gap in philosophy. You have a huge gap in philosophy between Hegel and then really much later, even in the 19th or in the.
You see, I only know about theater.
And Wagner actually occupies that place, and Wagner occupies that place as a way of filling this enormous anxiety about human communication through language. And music actually does play that role, and if the Jews identify with it, it's not only because they're Jews, it's because they also live inside language and are extremely frustrated by what language thinks it's doing. And when you get to the 20th century, you have an important name who exists in this room, I'm delighted to say, and that is Wittgenstein. And it's Wittgenstein who confronts this problem as a 20th century philosopher with a huge gap in the 19th century. So it is a Jewish problem, but it's not only a Jewish problem.
You put it really, both you and Christina, in a very succinct way, and that is that if German is the only language you know, and you are denied the moral right to and the practical right to speak it, then you're really robbed of the fundament of your whole existence. What do you say, Christina?
Yes, I think I would even go further. For one thing, I want to say these Germans were flocking to Bayreuth. The non-Jewish German was flocking to Bayreuth.
Of course.
And as far as the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s is concerned, the West German establishment was flocking to Bayreuth.
In
all
last
those
century,
who wanted to forget Nazism or the guilt the Germans had taken over as a heritage went to Bayreuth. It was a way of forgetting about Nazism. And now I think we should really turn away from the doer, the perpetrator Wagner, and ask, why are people picking up Wagner? What do they really want from him? What is the thing they're looking for in Bayreuth or in any of the big opera houses? And I think there we get a bit closer to the whole problem of what is being treated here. I reuse the term of the unconscious. I think there are two ways of going about the unconscious. One is the way which Freud proposes, to try and verbalize what is going on below language, what is going on in the unknown parts of language, let's say. And the other way is the way Wagner says, I want to occupy the unconscious. I want this to be my terrain of empowerment. And this is what the Nazis liked about him. He showed the way. You could occupy the emotions, you could occupy the psyche of people, and the Nazis loved him not so much for the Nibelungen and all this Germanic stuff. They loved him because he showed the techniques of doing it. He, as you were saying before, you talked about cinema and Wagner. Wagner invented the darkened auditorium. He invented the abyss where the orchestra, so that only a mystical sound would come out from there. So Wagner has really was a predecessor of modern cinema and all these techniques of modern cinema, which are techniques, at least obviously
Need
not
to take hold of the audience.
Take hold of the audience, take hold of the unconscious and the emotions. Of course, a lot of filmmakers don't do that. Godard goes in another direction. A lot of other filmmakers go and try to work against this possibility of the cinema. But Wagner certainly showed the way you could go about technically getting emotions aroused within big populations.
You point out something very, because if we talk about Wagner as a man of the theater, most audiences today do not know that he, and you could also possibly add Ibsen, they were the inventors of the fact that we are supposed to sit still in an audience, that it's supposed to be more or less dark, that we are not allowed to run in and out, and also that no work of any other should be played the same night. Or you shouldn't take acts from your pieces and mix them with all kinds of others.
I would like
really
to react to this.
Wagner and Ibsen were the ones who really decided this. And that is, of course, on one level, the respect for the work of art. But on another level, it's very authoritarian.
Yeah. Well, I wanted exactly to point make an accent on that point. That for me, Wagner is the prophet of 20th century totalitarianism. There is something very totalitarian about his music. His music, as Hanslick has noted at the time, is not a music that opens its arms to you, that entices you to come closer to it. It is a music that imposes itself on you. It is a music that makes you either yield to it or rebel against it. And so this is a kind of music that is really very prone to the totalitarian attitude of making of people just members of a multitude, of a mass, and not individualizing them. Tolstoy, who I think was present at the first festival in Bayreuth, came out and said that the level of Wagner's poetry is of a 7-year-old child, a 7-year-old kid. And I think that we should pay attention to the fact that there is something very infantile in Wagner's plots, and there is something very infantile in that attempt to say either or. There is in his, I think in the Valkyrian dance, there is the yoho toho, yoho toho, yoho toho, hoyo toho, hoyo toho. Now, in a very funny way for a Hebrew ear, hoyo toho is almost either Yehovah or tohu vavohu. Yeah, it's either God or chaos, God or chaos, God or chaos. Yeah. I don't know if Wagner was aware of it, but I think
women shout that.
Women
at the same
shout
time.
it. Yes, that's exactly. Yeah, women shout it. Whenever I hear it, I think that Wagner somehow there was something in his subconscious that brought out that kind of outcry. It's either God or chaos. There's nothing in between. And this joins the attitude of our God in the Bible, who says, "You will not have another God beside me." And if you try to have another God beside me, woe to you, and all the
bye-bye.
Whatever punishments of the world will come upon you. But At the same time, you have in the same Bible Abraham arguing with God and proving to God that he's not right, and about Sodom, you know, that he was a bit too...
Severe?
Yeah, not severe, but inconsiderate of the possibility that he's going to do some evil act. We have Job, who argues with God, and the end of the argument says, well, you are too strong for me because you can destroy me. Who am I? So in a way, it is saying to God, you're wrong, but I can't, well, of course, you are more powerful, so what can I do? You have Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, in the Bible, who says, well, it's a totally, I would say, atheist attitude in Kohelet. There is nothing. Nothing is... well, at the end, there is nothing. It's like almost taking Shakespeare's last Macbeth monologue, where he says a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So you have in the Bible itself this kind of double attitude of a God who says, either you worship me or you will be exterminated. And the other attitude of saying, no, sir, you are wrong, and I call you to order. Now, the whole thing about Kabbalah, that was a later development of Judaism, a very intellectual one, is the idea that God is imperfect, and you have to bring God to perfection by human deeds. So by doing, here I join what Igor has said, it's by being humane that you improve God, because God is not humane. And you have to take care of every deed that you are doing in relationship to other people in your life as a human being, thinking that by doing evil, you are not helping God to be perfect. You are strengthening God's imperfection. Whereas if you are dealing humanely, you are improving God and then bringing redemption to the world, maybe at the end of the day. I wanted to say something about the 1 and 0, which is very interesting. I think that this attitude of God or Tohu Vabohu, yeah, Yoho, Hoyo or Toyo, Hoyo Toyo, I think that this has to do with something very basic in Judaism that I came to this conclusion very recently, that Judaism probably is the founder of digital of the digital universe, which is based only on 1 and 0. And I have in my mind, I'm now obsessed with a mathematician who wants to eliminate 1. He says if we eliminate 1, the whole system of the virtual world will fall apart, and we will have again to face the real world and not be intoxicated by the virtual world. Yes. But I will conclude only with one thing. I think that when we see Hitler's representation standing there, you know, like almost a caricature of a Wagnerian Siegfried, and you think of what Speer has done with his lighting cathedrals, which are totally Wagnerian, and you see all this kind of intoxication of a nation, intoxication of a people. Then I think that Wagnerian music, I'm not talking about the text is not intoxicating. I must say, I read the texts and I was not intoxicated by Wagner's text. But the music is intoxicating. And if you really, as we heard here, you are recommended to close your eyes, to forget the text, and to let the music carry you away. We know that Thomas Mann, who was a Wagnerian at the beginning, changed his mind at a certain point and became a kind of anti-Wagnerian, saying that Wagnerian music is dangerous, that it is dangerous. And this is why I think that in Israel we should play Wagner, and we should listen to Wagner, we should cope with Wagner and understand to what extent he is dangerous, and his ideology is dangerous, and his attitude in art is dangerous, and I think we shouldn't be afraid of it. We should cope with it. Therefore, I think that in a way, Wagner is a challenge to Jews, to Judaism, and as I said before, I believe that it comes from the interior of Judaism in a way. this kind of totalitarian attitude, provoking you to be anti-totalitarian, to say, no, 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 I don't accept it. I listen to you, I hear your voice, I see how dangerous you are, I see how you try to mobilize me, I will not follow.
But that's Joshua, that's really what every person who, for example, approaches Wagner as a director today must think.
I think so. I'm not a director and not a musicologist, but I think this is probably the way to approach Wagner nowadays. I mean, to show how intoxicating this music can be and to detoxicate the Wagnerian world in a way. By the way, I know that Wagner, after the first festival in Bayreuth, he was a bit disappointed with
much disappointed,
and he thought that he was going on the wrong path, and he wanted to change something. I think that Wagner was talented enough. I'm very careful of using the word genius, etc. But he had enough talent and enough skill to understand that what he did in the first festival was wrong, that it was too clumsy, too imposing, too big, too much. And he wanted to change it, but unfortunately he didn't have the chance, he didn't have the force anymore to deal with it. And Cosima, who was a totalitarian character, by the way, and I think she became Wagner's dictator in a way, and she perpetuated the wrong Wagnerian tradition. This is what I'm trying to say here. Well, she didn't do a good service to Wagner, I think.
But she helped very much with the sort of what some people call a Verfälschung and others call a natural kind of building Wagner into a Deutsch national monument.
Yeah, can I just say something?
Yes, of course.
I sort of find it very difficult when you have perpetrators and then afterwards it's the women who the wives of these perpetrators. That, I think, is something I have difficulty coping with. As Igor pointed out, and yourself pointed out, Wagner was very difficult, if not to say sadistic, with women, including Cosima. And she was destroyed, and she loved it. That's her problem. But in any case, she was destroyed, and she became Wagnerian after having been
and she was not alone in this
exactly.
kind of...
I really have
she
a
had
problem
good help
with
from
this,
Wolfsoger.
because they are not intoxicated with Cosima's.
I think Wagner and the Cosima.
Maybe. But in any case, people are not intoxicated with Cosima's diaries or whatever. They are intoxicated by the music. And that is my question to you, Joshua. How do you detoxicate people who don't want to be detoxicated? That is really a problem.
Can I just come in? Because that sort of, the other question hanging over this is, why do people continue to go? Why do people get obsessed at a young age, like I was initially? And the reason is very simple. People tell you to. And that's often the reason why the canon, how the canon is inherited. And each generation has a different canon. So you have to be very careful to not perpetuate the canon as if Wagner must reside at the top of Mount Olympus forever. I mean, at that pinnacle, there were several greats. Heinrich Schütz for 100 years was the great. I mean, who remembers him? People thought that Rameau's treatise on harmony was the thing to read, etc., for half a century. Each generation has its greats. They fall away, and I think that we perpetuate. I think it's problematic to continue to claim Wagner's greatness when his greatness among composers of the last 70 years is definitely questionable. I mean, it's almost sort of an abusive relationship that music's had to deal with and has had to go to a shrink for. I mean, the tumult within composition of the last 70 years is down to Wagner's totalitarianism in terms of what music should be. That music should seduce and suffocate in the way that Wagner's music did, is not necessarily how music should be. It definitely wasn't how music was before Wagner, and it hasn't been how music is post the 1940s. And we've been slowly deconstructing and detoxifying music as something that should be this this thing that kind of invades you and has you like this,
But,
you know, as if that is an intelligent way to be, and
I would like to put in a kind of brief commercial for the difference between seduction and suffocation. I hope there's still a little bit of a gap between them, and I would also like to return a little bit to the idea of two sides to certain questions. Absolutely, that the totalitarian, certainly the seduction and possibly some suffocation, and possibly the mastering of the unconscious as one side. But the other side is really a certain kind in 19th century terms, which ultimately is a question of taste as the 21st century returns to the 19th century or not. But in 19th century terms, there is also the kind of liberation of the unconscious, which is also very dangerous. So the danger of experiencing the world through the unconscious is in a way the other side of danger and the other side of Wagner. And it's certainly what Freud had in mind when he said that the poets predated him in playing with the unconscious, so to speak. Freud is himself very complex in his own denial of his musical experiences. There are several interesting people writing about that right now. He claimed that he had no taste for music, but he was also a bit scared of what it would mean to fall under the spell of 19th century music. But there is a sense of getting in there into the unconscious, which happens quite a bit in Wagner within a certain moment and aesthetic.
Which an audience seems to still to crave. Because I simply say, now I think we have to round this off, but I think we have come to some very interesting points on which very many people would differ because they see this quite differently and think that they have already made up with lots of the problems, which, for example, Joshua describes, I think, a bit flippantly to say that you describe Wagner as God of the Old Testament, who say, follow me or you will be exterminated. And the other way you point to, the way of making God more perfect, that's really what should be the object of people who go with a new kind of consciousness into using or not using this music and this heritage. And I think, Igor, that this, what you are talking about, has very much to do with when I said very also flippantly that somebody wins the war of musicology and has the right to describe what's good. But now we are in a situation when, for example, a big German opera house, or rather big Nuremberg, they say that the condition for them to produce a new ring is to produce for each part of the ring a work by Meyerbeer or Alevi or whatever. Yes, of course, because the audience needs to know that this is what Wagner was inspired by, stole from, also wanted to obliterate, exactly. And on another level, I think every director and conductor of further Wagnerian performances must also take at heart what you are pointing to when we talk about the authoritarian will in this art, in the music of Wagner. And that's somewhere you want to add something?
Yes, I like this idea of Meyerbeer and alternating with Wagner. I think you're even better off if you take Schönberg or if you take Schreker.
Yeah.
Schreker, who is copying on one side, but on the other side trying to break up this whole totalitarian system.
But Schreker, we got quite a bit of Schreker during the last 20 years, while Meyerbeer and the older ones are even more in the bad class, and also being an opera dramaturg for 15 seasons in Stockholm, I know exactly what kind of arguments you get from if you try to say, but why don't we do Berlioz instead? The kind of arguments you could get from people who are far from regarding themselves as prophets for Wagnerism. They said, but isn't that bad music? And the most fantastic experience I had was that I brought one.
They shouldn't be working.
Yes, they should be working, doing their homework. One of my most fantastic experiences in this is that I went with one of my bosses, I won't say whom, to see a performance of the Jewess, La Juive, somewhere in Europe. And in the first of 3 intervals, because it has Wagnerian proportions, it's very, very long, and it's not anti-Semitic, although they kill all the Jews at the end. It's written by a Jew. But she looked up, the boss looked up at me and said, "Oh, you hear very much he took from Wagner." And then I said, "But yes, whatever Wagner could have produced at the age of 17. So the discussion goes on. I think we have heard very worthwhile contributions who have brought this a bit flippant suggestion of mine, Wagner and the Jews from 2 years ago, has given us much more interesting views than we could ever hope for. And I hope the arrangers, they agree with me. They are waving here and there. And Lizzie, I think we have come to the end, and we should talk, we should thank our panel, and you can thank me, and I thank Irene, and we all thank the audience. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, really, very, very interesting. And so I hope to see you on the 15th of May, but before that I want to say thank you very much to Monica Nogler-Wittgenstein, because this is yours. Both Tainted Greatness is yours. Thank you very much.
So, thank you.